Over 1,000 years ago, Anglo-Saxon kings ruled over Britain and expected the people to keep good order, which they called keeping the peace. Citizens were responsible for seeing that the law was not broken, and if it was, to catch the offenders themselves, or they risked receiving a fine. In time, it became the duty of every free citizen to take his turn as a local parish constable, serving for a year. The position was unpaid, and he was expected to combine his ordinary work as best he could. He had no uniform, but carried an official staff of office. The duties were not popular and often unpleasant, with the constable having little chance to do his normal job properly. Over the years, the population increased, and communities grew larger, so that policing, even at a local level, required constant attention. Consequently, well-to-do citizens with trades or businesses began to pay others to take over their policing duties. In 1663, the City of London began to employ paid watchmen to guard the streets at night. These men came to be nicknamed Charlies, possibly after the sovereign of the time, Charles II. The type of equipment they carried included a rattle, a lantern, and a staff, which provided their only form of self-defense. The tiny sums paid to them attracted men who were old and weak. Nevertheless, they were probably the most effective night police anywhere in the country until the end of the 18th century. In 1748, Henry Fielding became Chief Magistrate for Westminster, with his office in Bow Street, near Covent Garden. He realized that London needed a more permanent and efficient force than local constables, and recruited 6 householders to serve as constables for more than the usual term of 1 year. They still had no uniform, but they were paid a salary for working full-time, and became known as the Bow Street Runners. Henry and his blind half-brother John, who later took over his work, began a lifetime campaign to police London properly. As the Industrial Revolution transformed England from a rural to an industrial country, thousands of people left the countryside to look for work. And towns like Birmingham and Manchester grew at a staggering rate. Enormous numbers could not find employment and lived in the most appalling slums, with no protection by a welfare system. It was an atmosphere that bred crime. One of the greatest areas for theft in London was the River Thames, with merchant ships laden with expensive cargoes constantly loading and unloading at warehouses in the docks. Riverside workers and organized gangs were responsible for colossal losses. A sea captain named John Harriot and a London magistrate, Patrick Colquhoun, devised a scheme for policing the river and persuaded merchants to pay for a marine police force, which started operating in 1798. The 60 or so salaried officers were armed with cutlasses for self-defense and operated from rowing boats. They soon became a respected law-keeping force and grew to be the largest regular professional police force of the time, joining the Metropolitan Police in 1839. The success of the River Police encouraged the growth of the Bow Street Police, and the Bow Street Horse Patrols were revived in 1805. In a typically British way, both Parliament and people distrusted the idea of a uniform professional police force. and resisted any such move because of the threat to individual freedom. But attitudes were soon compelled to change. A great period of social unrest enveloped the country and culminated in a number of severe riots. In 1819, a troop of yeomanry charged a peaceful mass meeting of 60,000 weavers in St. Peter's Field in Manchester, killing 11 and wounding over 500. When rioting occurred, the local authorities called in the army, who were not trained to cope with riots and crowd control. The Peterloo Massacre, as it came to be known, helped accelerate the process of change towards the introduction of a professional police force. Sir Robert Peel, a skillful politician, became Home Secretary in 1822 and carefully made police reforms without arousing the public fear of intimidation. He believed in crime prevention rather than relying on punishment as a deterrent. In 1829, legislation was passed by Parliament to establish the Metropolitan Police in London, a single force for an area roughly within a circle of 7 miles from the centre of London. Colonel Charles Roane and Richard Mayne became Joint Commissioners with their headquarters in 4 Whitehall Place, known as Scotland Yard. The police constables wore deliberately civilian-style top hats and blue swallow-tail coats and carried wooden truncheons and a rattle which they used to raise the alarm and call for help. Called the New Police, they also gained the nicknames of Peelers and Bobbies, after Peel. Recruits to the new force had to be under 35 years of age, be in good health and strong, and be at least 5 feet 7 inches tall. As Peel wanted his force to be a really good body of men. The Bobby was to be calm, quiet, and determined, as well as bold when he had to be, but above all he had to learn to keep his temper, however much he was provoked. Every recruit joined at the rank of constable, and promotion would only be given to those who earned it. From the beginning, the police force was a great success, but it took time for the public to accept the idea, and many brutal attacks were made against policemen. Reform was not limited to London, however. Other towns, such as Manchester and Cardiff, were actively forming their own police forces. One of the pioneer cities for the introduction of professional police was Glasgow, which has a claim to being the oldest police force in Britain, having paid policemen as early as 1800. In Ireland, Dublin and Belfast had formed town police forces by 1787. And in the same year, the baronial police began operating a body of untrained, part-time police over most of rural Ireland. The Constabulary Act of 1822 established a centrally controlled professional police force, which developed into the Constabulary of Ireland and then into the Royal Irish Constabulary in 1867. Becoming the model for a number of colonial police forces throughout the world. When the government changed the way towns and boroughs were governed in the 1830s, they made it compulsory for every local authority to provide a professional police force. Some set up forces on the London model, but many rural areas were reluctant to meet the expense. Inspectors were appointed to visit every force and assess the standards to see if they would qualify for a government grant to help meet the cost. The lifestyle of the Victorian policeman was particularly harsh, and the pay was poor, about the same as a farm labourer, although it was better in some city forces. A constable would work to a system of shifts, which would mean 6 or 7 hours on days, evenings, or nights. Until 1868, he worked 7 days a week with no rests, which meant that many men became too ill to work. He walked his beat, patrolling the streets or lanes and meeting up with his beat sergeant at pre-arranged points, which was a kind of clocking-in system. The rural policeman was assigned to a village and a special house was provided for lodging. They tended to integrate better within the community and became trusted and popular. However, the low pay tended to attract unskilled and uneducated people, and the public image of the average police constable was of a worthy but rather thick Mr. Plod. A major problem of the time was drunkenness amongst the public and the police themselves. Many of the original peelers were dismissed within 10 years for being drunk on duty. As well as arresting drunks, the constable had to cope with all manner of public duties, including fighting fires, breaking up fights, petty felony, as well as serious crime. The new police tended to be essentially thief catchers, not detectives, and they were often hindered by their uniform, which had to be worn even when off duty, and contained some diverse regional variations.